The last thing Adrian expected at his coworker's wedding was to be asked to leave the celebration with a warning that would change his life forever. He had come only because he didn't want to disappoint a colleague who had stood beside him during the hardest year of his life. Wearing the only dark suit he owned, carefully hiding the tiredness beneath his eyes, Adrian looked like any other guest. But unlike most people in that elegant ballroom, he had spent the previous night calculating whether he could afford his daughter's school books and the electricity bill at the same time. He was a single father, a man who had learned to smile even when he was exhausted, to work overtime even when his body begged for rest, and to tell his 8-year-old daughter that everything would be okay even when he had no idea whether it would be. He thought this wedding would be nothing more than an uncomfortable evening among wealthy strangers. He had no idea that someone inside that room already knew his name, his struggles, and a secret about his past that Adrian himself had almost forgotten. If stories about second chances, kindness, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things touch your heart, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Bright Acts for more stories about second chances. Adrian arrived at the wedding just before sunset. The venue was breathtaking, filled with warm golden lights, white flowers, polished tables, and guests dressed in clothes that probably cost more than his monthly rent. He felt strangely out of place, but when his coworker Marcus saw him, he immediately rushed over and hugged him. Marcus had always treated Adrian differently from the others at work. He never pitted him, never asked embarrassing questions about his divorce, and never made him feel less important because Adrian sometimes had to leave early to pick up his daughter, Sophie. Adrian smiled and congratulated him, genuinely happy that at least one person in his life was beginning a beautiful new chapter. For a while, he allowed himself to enjoy the evening. He watched the bride and groom dance, listened to laughter around him, and even accepted a small piece of wedding cake. Yet every few minutes, his phone reminded him of reality. Sophie was staying with their elderly neighbor that night, and Adrian kept checking for messages because she had been unusually quiet all afternoon. Then he noticed the woman standing near the edge of the ballroom. She was the groom's sister, Elena, and unlike the other guests, she wasn't laughing or celebrating. She was staring directly at Adrian. At first he assumed she was simply curious about him, but when their eyes met for the third time, Elena walked toward him with a serious expression. She stopped beside his table and quietly asked him to come with her because she needed to speak to him somewhere private. Adrian's stomach tightened. He immediately wondered whether he had somehow offended someone. He followed her through a hallway and into a quiet garden behind the ballroom. The music faded behind them, replaced by the soft sound of a fountain. Elena stood silently for several seconds before asking whether Adrian had worked at a construction company called Northbridge several years earlier. Adrian froze. That name belonged to a chapter of his life he rarely discussed. Before becoming a maintenance supervisor at his current company, he had worked at Northbridge during a terrible period when his wife was still alive. He nodded slowly. Elena then told him that her father had owned Northbridge at the time. Adrian remembered the older man immediately, a demanding but fair businessman named Victor Hale. He had died 3 years earlier. Then Elena revealed the reason. Her father had left a private letter before his death, and Adrian's name was written on the envelope. Adrian felt the world become strangely quiet. He had not spoken to Victor in years. Elena explained that shortly before Victor died, he had discovered that one of his senior managers had been stealing money from the company. The manager had attempted to blame Adrian for missing equipment and falsified records. Adrian had nearly lost his job and could have faced criminal charges. But at the last moment, Victor had investigated personally and discovered that Adrian had been working extra shifts because another employee was injured. Victor cleared his name. Adrian remembered the incident, but he had never known what happened afterward because, around the same time, his wife became seriously ill, and his entire life collapsed into hospital rooms, medical bills, and sleepless nights. Elena reached into her purse and handed him a sealed envelope. Her father had written that Adrian was one of the few employees he trusted completely. He had described him as a man who worked quietly, protected his coworkers, and never asked for recognition. Victor had apparently wanted to help Adrian financially, but Adrian had refused any special treatment at the time because he didn't want anyone to think he had earned his position through sympathy. The letter said that if Victor ever had another opportunity to help him, he should do it without making Adrian feel like a charity case. Adrian's hands trembled as he read the final page. Victor had established a small private foundation before his death, designed to help hardworking employees and their families during difficult times. Elena told Adrian that her father had specifically included him among the people the foundation could support. She had only recently found the letter while sorting through old documents, and she had spent weeks trying to locate him. Adrian immediately shook his head. He thanked her, but he couldn't accept money simply because someone felt sorry for him. Elena looked at him with tears in her eyes and explained that this wasn't charity. Her father had believed Adrian deserved the opportunity to rebuild his life because he had spent years helping others without expecting anything in return. The foundation could cover Sophie's education for several years and provide Adrian with enough assistance to clear the debts that had been keeping him awake at night. For the first time that evening, Adrian stopped pretending he was fine. He admitted that there were nights when he sat alone at his kitchen table after Sophie went to sleep, staring at unpaid bills and wondering how long he could continue carrying everything by himself. He confessed that he had become so used to surviving that he had forgotten what it felt like to hope. Elena didn't tell him to be strong. She simply reminded him that accepting help did not erase his strength. When Adrian returned to the ballroom, everything looked different. The same flowers were on the tables, the same music filled the room, and people were still dancing, but something inside him had shifted. He called the neighbor and asked about Sophie. She was fine. Then he sat quietly for several minutes, letting the weight he had carried for years finally loosen. Later that night, Elena found him again and gave him one final piece of news. Her father had also recommended Adrian for a management position within a company connected to the family foundation. It was a position with better pay, regular hours, and enough flexibility for him to remain present in Sophie's life. Adrian stared at her, overwhelmed. He had spent years believing his life was permanently defined by loss. Yet in a single evening, someone had reminded him that his past sacrifices had not been invisible. The following morning, Adrian sat beside Sophie at their small kitchen table and told her that things were going to change. He didn't give her every detail because she was still too young to understand them, but he showed her the letter from Victor. Sophie read it slowly, then looked up at her father and asked whether this meant he wouldn't have to worry so much anymore. Adrian smiled through tears and told her that maybe, for the first time in a long time, they could start dreaming instead of simply surviving. Months later, Adrian's life looked completely different. Sophie joined an art program she had always wanted to attend. Adrian moved into a modest but comfortable home where the kitchen had enough space for them to cook together. He kept working hard, but now he no longer worked until midnight just to stay afloat. And every time someone at his new workplace needed help, Adrian remembered the lesson Victor had left behind. Kindness may disappear from our sight for years, but it never truly disappears. At Marcus's wedding, Adrian had thought he was simply attending another person's happy day. Instead, he discovered that sometimes life chooses the most unexpected moments to return a little of what we have given to others. He had spent years believing nobody noticed his sacrifices, but someone had noticed. Someone had remembered, and someone had quietly prepared a door for him long before he even knew he needed one. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who may be struggling silently, and subscribe to Bright Acts. Sometimes one small act of kindness can become the reason another person keeps going. And before you leave, comment, "Everyone deserves a second chance," if you believe that kindness should never be wasted. Because Adrian learned something that night that he would carry for the rest of his life. Sometimes the person who thinks they are barely surviving